a sirene aqui, tá ligado?
Não faz mais a sirene? Deu?
Só é a
Deixa eu
é sobre ele.
testar o outro também. Um, dois.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to have Professor Andrei Marmor from Cornell University to be with us. And well, Marmor doesn't really need a full formal presentation. It was already there's a lot of information in the advertisement of this lecture. But I just would like to add that he's one of the major legal philosophers of contemporary debate. So he's really what I consider one of the most influential and most creative legal thinkers. So it's really a privilege. I don't want to waste more time and take the opportunity of all of you to listen to him. I just would like to thank Iago Mina, Daniel Murata, and João Vitor for the wonderful job in organizing this. This was possible basically due to their effort. So I'd like to to thank you for all the effort. And I, without further ado, I just would like to listen to you.
This works? Okay. Actually, I'll sit. Maybe I'll stand up. You have to, I'm sorry if you have to. But something is making really bad noise. No. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Is this on? Can you hear me? Thanks. Thanks for inviting me. I apologize for being late, so I will not waste time on introductions. And I'll try to leave enough time for questions, which I'm really looking forward. So my topic today is artifacts, the nature of artifacts. And I'll start by trying to explain briefly why legal philosophy should be interested in artifacts, nature of artifacts. And then I will say quite a bit about what artifacts are and the nature of artifacts. And I will make an argument. And the argument is that there are certain types of group-wide errors that are not possible with respect to certain aspects of artifacts. And I will try to show that this has important implications for certain positions in philosophy of law. So that's the structure. Why should we be interested in artifacts? So I assume you know something about the debate between positivism and anti-positivism, all that old and boring stuff. But here's a commitment of any position that sees itself as anti-positivist. And I think that this commitment is the most problematic one for anti-positivists to justify, even though they kind of take it for granted. Every anti-positivist position, be it Dworkin, whoever, is committed to the possibility, to acknowledging the possibility that an entire legal community would be wrong about its laws. Yeah. Get its laws wrong. Why is that? So according to all the anti-positivist positions, what the law is depends, at least in some cases, according to Dworkin always, but according to other anti-positivists, at least in some cases, depends on moral truth. It depends on what is morally the correct answer. Okay, that's the gist of any anti-positivist position. Okay. Now, they don't have to have very specific views or very concrete views about the nature of morality, but they do have to have the view that morality is not just what people think that it is. Yeah. In other words, they have to reject kind of primitive, single-minded subjectivism about morality. Because if we allow for the possibility that what is morally correct is whatever people think that is morally correct, then the view, the anti-positivist view, as a view in legal philosophy, becomes very uninteresting. Because it then becomes the view that whatever people think is the law is the law. Well, that's exactly what positivists say. So it's not really anti-positivist. For the anti-positivist view to have a bite, we have to think that people can be wrong about what is morally correct. Because what morality requires is not just, did you figure it out, Diego? That would be very thank you. Can you put something underneath?
Rocket
Much better.
science.
Yes.
Não pode tirar aqui, se voltar a fazer isso.
Okay.
Okay.
So anti-positivists have to assume that people, by people I mean entire legal communities, can be wrong about moral issues, can make moral mistakes, which is a totally plausible view, right? I mean, it's a totally commonsensical view about the nature of morality. But then it follows, if morality, if what law is, sometimes at least, depends on what is morally true, and people can make mistakes, entire communities can be mistaken about what is morally true, it follows that entire legal communities can be mistaken about what the law requires, about what the law is. That's a commitment of any and every anti-positivist view, okay? That's the working assumption here. Now, if we admit that whatever else the law is an artifact, then that creates a big problem for anti-positivism, because if something is an artifact, then there are certain types of mistakes that cannot be made about its nature by an entire community. And that's what I'm going to argue, okay? I'm not the only one who argues that about artifacts. But I think I can defend that position and refine it in certain ways that were not existent in the literature before. So I'm going to forget about the law till the end of the lecture, right? You have the context, and now I'm going to talk about what artifacts are and what is it that we can say about them, and in particular, what kind of mistakes about artifacts an entire community can make and what kind of mistakes they cannot. Okay. So how do we get this idea of artifacts? Well, goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle is the one who distinguished initially between what he called things that exist by nature and artificial products. So the distinction is very intuitive, right? Certain things exist by nature. They would have been here even if there were no human beings. Yeah, mountains and rivers and all of that. Yeah, and lots of things are created by human beings, are products of human agency, and those are artifacts. Okay. Now, as we will see, the category of artifacts covers enormous ground. Yeah, if you just think about it, look around. Yeah, in an urban environment, almost everything you see and almost everything you use is an artifact, right? To get a piece of nature, you have to drive 3 hours. Yeah. So artifacts are all over. Now, the category. Okay. The distinction between artifacts and things that exist by nature is not so simple. I mean, there are borderline cases. There are all sorts of unclear cases. It's not a very sharp distinction. There are all sorts of things we manipulate in nature, but doesn't necessarily make them artifacts. So think about cherry tomatoes, you know, the little tomatoes. They were manipulated by human beings. They are, in a way, artificially produced. But it's kind of weird to say that cherry tomatoes are artifacts, right? They're still tomatoes. They still exist by nature. So there are these intermediate categories. I'm going to focus on clear cases of artifacts when there's no doubt that something is a product of human agency. And clear cases of artifacts roughly divide in two main categories. Some are tangible, like chairs and desks and computers and screwdrivers and cars, etc., etc., etc. And some, quite a lot actually, are intangible, right? They're not physical objects. One obvious, important example is language, natural language, English, Portuguese, etc., right? They are products of human agency. They did not exist by nature, but they are not physical objects. Yeah? And everything we do with language, stories, narratives, poems, novels, papers in philosophy of law, all of that, right? Contents are artifacts. So we have tangible and we have intangible artifacts. Now, we have to be a bit more precise here because not everything that results from human agency makes sense to call an artifact. So if I hum some tune in the shower, yeah, the tune, if we can even call it a tune, not when I do it, would be something that results from my agency. But it's not an artifact. Yeah. Why is that? Because artifacts are products of human agency. And by product, we mean at least two things. One, they have to be produced. They have to be made by human agency deliberately. But second, they have to be the kind of things that are recognizable as tokens of a type, that are recognizable as products of a certain kind, which means that they have to have some durability in time. They have to be reproducible, replicable, etc. Right? So that's what we call artifacts, and that applies both to tangible and intangible artifacts. Okay. Now, artifacts are sometimes created by individual agency, yeah, like when a carpenter can make a chair, or a philosopher can write a paper. But most artifacts we are familiar with are actually products of collective agency. Lots of people are involved in creating them. Again, the obvious example is language. It's not only lots of people who created Portuguese, it's also a very diffuse group of people, right? We can't, name them. So the production of artifacts is sometimes mass production, right? Involving huge amounts of agents, lots of agents, and of a very diffuse and indeterminate number. I call these large-scale produced artifacts massive artifacts. Yeah, so language would be a massive artifact. Myths would be massive artifacts. Religions would be massive artifacts, etc., etc. Sorry. There is a view in the literature, quite dominant view, that ties artifacts to intentional creation. And there's some truth in it, right? I mean, artifacts are usually created by human agency. So even if it's large-scale human agency, collective agency, we're talking about actions done with certain intentions, intentional action. Artifacts are usually not produced unintentionally. But tying the creation of artifacts to intentions is potentially very misleading. So there is a view in the literature that, the nature of artifacts is very closely tied to its authorship, to its creation. Since the assumption is that an artifact is produced by deliberate creation of an agent, then the assumption is that the nature of the artifact is what the agent intended to produce, to make. And that's clearly wrong, because that really rules out all massive artifacts as artifacts, right? Nobody deliberately created English or Portuguese. That's ridiculous. Nobody deliberately created an urban myth or a legend, or things like that, right? So we have to be careful not to tie artifacts too closely to intentions. Okay. Now, what determines the nature of an artifact, right? So if it's not the intention, not necessarily the intention of the creator, what else can it be? So here there is a little bit of a difference between tangible and intangible artifacts. The nature of tangible artifacts is determined by a combination of two factors. One is the physical properties of the object, whatever it is, right? So what a car is, partly determined by its physical properties, and by its use, by its function. Yeah. What cars are as artifacts is determined by the way we use it. And the features of it as a car are essentially the features that manifest its use. Well, in one of the other lectures, I don't remember now which one, I will talk in much greater detail about the idea of function and the connection between function and general use. So that will come up later. It's not super essential for now. Intangible artifacts are a little bit more complicated, a bit more complex. First of all, there's probably no example, we can't think of an intangible artifact that does not have some tangible aspect. The story has to be told by someone. So there's some physical aspect there of telling a story or writing it, reading it, putting words on paper. Even a legend has to have been told by some people at some point. Yeah. Art is conveying certain content by various means of manipulating things, sometimes manipulating human behavior, like dance or performative arts, etc. So there's always some tangible aspect to intangible artifacts, allowing us to produce contents that are conveyed to others. Yeah. But essentially, the nature of the artifact is the content that is conveyed, the content that is communicated in some form or believed or assumed, etc. And it's very difficult to articulate what content exactly is. And I'm just going to rely on intuitive understanding of it, because it would take too long to articulate that. I'm just assuming we understand it. Okay. I need to see. Give me a sense of time. Like, when should I stop talking?
No, you can go as much
Good.
as you need to make an argument.
Oh, okay. All right.
Free. You have one.
All right. Both about tangible and intangible artifacts. One thing to notice, and this will become important later, is that artifacts always come with a vocabulary of success and failure. People can intend to create artifacts and fail in producing them. You know, I can intend to write a poem, and trust me, any poem that I will try to write will be embarrassing. People can create better or worse artifacts. The artifacts can be more or less successful. So some vocabulary of normative vocabulary of success and failure is always appropriate when we're talking about artifacts. Yeah. Artifacts can be extremely complex, but in two different ways. I'll just mention them briefly. One is pretty obvious. So most artifacts that you would find around you are actually composed of tons and tons of other artifacts. Yeah. I looked it up on Google. I don't know how reliable it is, but an ordinary car is composed of 30,000 pieces, artifacts. Yeah. And that's probably outdated. Probably these days it's even more. Yeah. Now try to imagine how many parts there are in a Boeing 777 airplane. Yeah. Probably, I don't know, hundreds of thousands. So it means that there are a lot of people involved. It's a huge collective endeavor to create artifacts of that kind. But the relation here is between parts and whole, a relation of construction, right? Lots of little parts, and we construct them in a certain way, and we get an airplane. Yeah. The same about the story, a novel, right? So the relation between the particular sentences, the individual words, the syntax, all of that, and the whole story is, at least in part, a matter of construction, right? But that's not the only type of relation between artifacts that bears on their content or on their features. And that's actually important in the legal case. So sometimes the nature of an artifact, what kind of artifact it is, depends on its relation to other artifacts. Yeah. The easiest example is contemporary art. So went with Daniel and Iago yesterday to the Biennale here. Strongly recommend. If you haven't been, go and see. It's beautiful. And there are some weird things there, right? The weirdest was 2 lines on the floor, and it says, you know, you're, what does it say, like 3 meters in the direction of, I don't know what, Jakarta or something, yeah. So obviously, those 2 lines, yeah, the same stuff in somebody's backyard would be nothing, or, you know, since it's in the Biennale, we think of it as a work of art. In fact, I think I argue in a different paper, it is a work of art. Whether we like it or not, we can think it's a piece of crap, but it's still a work of art. Why is it a work of art? Well, partly because somebody put it there, right? Its relation to other artifacts. Yeah. Same thing in law. The same content, yeah, can be legally valid, can have legal significance in one context and have no legal significance in a different context. So if I say to Ronaldo, you can't park here, then might be good advice, but it's legally insignificant, right? Don't have the authority to just. But if the law, if the city council votes on that and, put up a sign, don't park here, then that's part of the law. Yeah. And the difference is not in the content. The difference is in the relation to other artifacts, conventions, rules, other laws, etc. Yeah. So in this way, legal content is analogous to an object in an art gallery, right? What makes it a work of art, its relation to other artifacts. What makes legal contents, is, again, its relation to other artifacts. Very different kind of nature, right? One assumption I'm making here, and I don't belabor that, but if you have doubts about it, I can elaborate, is that social rules and conventions are obviously artifacts. Huh? So if the law depends on social conventions, rules, things like that, then it partly depends on its nature, is partly affected by relation to other artifacts. Okay, so all this just by way of preparing the grounds for the main argument. And the main argument is that there are certain kinds of errors that an entire community that uses a certain artifact, creates and uses certain artifacts, cannot make about that artifact. Okay, certain types of mistakes are just metaphysically not possible. So I call these group-wide or comprehensive errors, and I have to be clear about what I mean by that. So about any artifact, individuals can make mistakes. No question about that. Yeah. Somebody may not know what screwdrivers are for and try to, I don't know, use it for something else. Well, that's an error. But it's an individual error. Easiest examples here are again from language, right? I mean, even native speakers of Portuguese can make mistakes about, words they use, misunderstand them, or grammatical structure, anything. Yeah. So individuals can always make mistakes. But an entire community of English speakers cannot make a mistake about the meaning of a word. Yeah. Here's the easiest example. Meaning is a little bit more tricky. Think about spelling. The spelling of words in Portuguese or English or French or whatever, right? So individuals can make spelling mistakes. Yeah. Even if they use a computer. Lots of individuals can make spelling mistakes. But if there is a particular mistake that most people make over a period of time, then it's no longer a mistake. Then it's just the spelling changed. Yeah. And actually the same applies to meanings of words, of individual words, right? Some people can misuse a word, misunderstand it. But if the misuse becomes the prevalent use, if it becomes the norm, then the word just gained a new meaning. Yeah, and we are familiar with these kinds of changes in every language, right? So it makes no sense to say that an entire community of English speakers makes a mistake about the spelling of English words. Yeah. And that's what I mean by group-wide error. Okay. So here's the core of the argument. The idea is that what an artifact is constituted by, it's determined by its prevalent use, the way people use it, the way people understand it, if it's content. Then an entire community cannot make a mistake about what it is. Yeah, that's the core. Now, it doesn't mean that an entire community cannot make any mistakes about artifacts. And here it's very important to draw some distinction. Roughly, what I'm going to argue is the following: that an entire community cannot make a mistake about the content or the use of an artifact. They can make mistakes about its ontology. And the most common type of mistake, ontological mistake, and I'll demonstrate that in a second, is mistaking artifacts for natural things, which is an ontological mistake. So let me give you an example, and then I'll show that it generalizes to all cases. So take an example from Greek mythology. Zeus, or the way Americans call it, Zeus, okay, the chief Olympian god. Yeah. So Greek mythology has a lot of stories about Zeus. It's, you know, a fictional character that, you know, we know a lot about it. Now let's assume that it's a fairly accurate historical assumption that in the 5th, 4th, 3rd century BC, in ancient Greece, vast majority of Greek people assumed that Zeus is a real entity. They thought that there is really a god up there on the mountain of Olympus that has these characteristics, and that, you know, these stories apply to that entity. Yeah. Well, they were wrong, we think. Yeah. There was no Zeus. It was an entirely fictional character. Yeah. So people can make mistakes about the ontology of artifacts. Fictional characters are artifacts. Yeah, I hope that's obvious. But there are certain kinds of mistakes they cannot make, right? We cannot come to discover that, oh, damn it, those ancient Greeks made a mistake about who Zeus was. He wasn't really the chief Olympian god. Or, you know, maybe he wasn't the god at all, just an old guy with a big beard. That's not possible, because the nature of Zeus, everything you can know about him, is constituted by the fiction, by the stories told about him, by Greek mythology. Yeah. Suppose some archaeologists or historians discover some Greek text that tells a very different story about Zeus. There was a story whereby, I don't know, Poseidon is the chief god and Zeus is just the sidekick. What then? Well, what then is very simple. We just have two separate narratives, two separate fictional characters named Zeus, right? And that's not surprising. That can easily happen. That does not prove that the Greeks could have been wrong about who Zeus is. They just had two Zeus, two different characters, two different narratives. And that actually is, again, a kind of prevalent feature of these mythologies, not just Greek mythology. The Hebrew Bible is full of these parallel narratives about the same fictional character, right? Even the famous story of how David kills Goliath. Actually, there are two stories in the Bible. They don't match. Two different mythologies. So that's common. But that doesn't show that people could have made a mistake about it. This just shows that there are two separate artifacts. Yeah. Okay. So the conclusion is, or what the example of Zeus aims to demonstrate, is that there is a certain type of mistakes about nature of artifacts that an entire community cannot make, and that are mistakes about content, right? Mistake about the nature of the thing it is. And that's true not just about content. It's also true about tangible artifacts, right? We cannot discover that we have been wrong all this time about what chairs are for, what's the nature of chairs. Whoops, it turns out that red chairs are not really chairs. Oh, we discovered that. That's just makes no sense, zero sense, yeah? Or that, you know, screwdrivers are not what we thought that they are. So it doesn't matter if it's tangible or intangible artifact. These kind of mistakes about content, about use, about purpose, about the nature of the thing are not possible. What is possible, and not very rare, is that entire communities can make ontological mistakes. They can think of something they created in collective imagination as something they discovered. And if you think about the number of deities in the history of humanity, many thousands, right? You think, surely that's a very common mistake, right? Even if you are religious and you believe in one God or two gods or three gods, you can't believe that all the gods in all the mythologies of human history are real entities. So at least some of them are fictional characters. And since the peoples who created these fictional characters didn't take them to be fictional, means that they were wrong. So ontological mistakes are quite common. Does it also happen the other way around? Can it happen that people take something to be an artifact, whereas in fact it's a thing that exists by nature, as it were. It's not an artifact. Those examples are difficult to give, right? They're not very common, but it's possible. Depends. So some people have that view about mathematics, right? They think that basic arithmetics is just a matter of convention or just a matter of human construction. And realists about mathematics would think the other way. Would think, no, they're not artifacts. They're not things that were created by human convention. They're real things. They exist independently of us. Numbers are real. Yeah. So at least it's debatable whether somebody is making an ontological mistake here, right? But again, we cannot come to discover that numbers are not what we thought that they are. Yeah. Okay. So that's the main thesis. I think it applies across the board. I think it's just generally true that entire communities cannot make comprehensive mistakes about the nature of an artifact, about what it is, its content, or its main use, but they can make ontological mistakes. So I want to answer a couple of possible objections to that. Yeah, because not everybody buys this argument. So I'll focus on two possible objections. The first one was presented to me over a glass of wine by my dear friend David Eno. Don't know if you ran across him. He's a philosopher, moral, legal. So David tells me something like this. I thought there's a lot of truth in what he said, right? He said, look, even people who create an artifact, say a fictional character, can actually make some mistakes about what they created. So if the creator can mistake what they created, why wouldn't the whole community comprehensively mistake that? And I agree about the first premise, but I think it's not the kind of mistake I'm talking about. So we need to tell a little bit of a more complicated story here. So let me work with an example. Here's the kind of example David had in mind. Take an Agatha Christie mystery. I used to be a great fan of Agatha Christie mysteries, especially where Poirot is the protagonist, the Poirot mysteries. It's very funny. Anyway, so we can imagine that Agatha Christie wanted to create Poirot as the smartest fellow in the story. Right? He figures everything out eventually, never makes a mistake, clearly the smartest guy. But suppose that somebody points out to her that he's not that smart after all. And some other character in the story may be more clever. Yeah, maybe, what's his name? Captain Hastings, the sidekick. Maybe he figured it out. Something like that. And she can come to see that and say, oh shit, I made a mistake. Yeah. And if she can make a mistake about it, right, then we could all have made a mistake about it. Yeah. Then comprehensive errors about the content are possible. So now the crucial question here is, what is it that we or she could have been wrong about? What do we mean by something like, well, in fact, Poirot is not as smart as you thought that he is? Yeah, what could we possibly mean by that? Well, remember I told you that artifacts always come with a vocabulary of success and failure. When you try to create something, you can fail to create it, you can create better or worse, more or less successful, etc. So this would just be an example where Agatha Christie failed to create what she wanted to create. Yeah. It's a critical standpoint. Yeah. Relative to some critical standard, it might be her own, what she wanted to achieve, or it might be some general literary standard or general observer standard. It's not as good as she wanted. Okay. And that's fine. That applies to all artifacts, right? The car that you bought may not be as good as you wanted it to be. It often isn't. But it doesn't mean that we can be mistaken about what cars are. Yeah. And the same about the character of Poirot. I mean, there are certain mistakes that are not possible about it. Yeah. She tells us in all the Poirot stories that Poirot is a Belgian detective. We cannot discover that he's actually Brazilian. Yeah. Look closer and, somehow you'll find out that he wasn't Belgian. or that he wasn't a detective, but I don't know, a shoe salesman. Yeah. That's not possible. That's like thinking that we can discover that chairs are not for sitting. Yeah. So I think that what David's point shows, this kind of objection shows, is that critical mistakes or critical perspectives, judgments about how good or bad something is or how successful it is, are always possible. And of course, people can be mistaken about it. Yeah. But they cannot mistake the content. They cannot misidentify what it is that they've created, what it is that the artifact is. Okay. So that's one objection. Here's the second objection, and that is the kind of objection that fans of Dworkin would like more. It is undeniable that we often have sensible arguments about what kind of thing an artifact is. Easy to give examples. And then if we can have sensible arguments, disagreements about what kind of thing an artifact is, then surely some people can be mistaken about it. Yeah, some can be right and others wrong. So we can have group-wide comprehensive errors about what kind of thing an artifact is. And that would be a serious challenge to the argument I'm presenting. So let's work with an example that's the most friendly to this objection. And again, that would be example. The easiest examples are about works of art, especially contemporary art. Yeah? So there is a work of art I've been beating on for years. It's not different from hundreds or thousands of others of its kind. It's called The Leaning Mirror by a pretty famous American artist in the 60s, Robert Smithson. And the work consists of, and I'm not kidding you, a pile of sand, the size of half of this table, and a mirror stuck diagonally in it. That's it. And it has a plaque, Leaning Mirror by Robert Smithson, and it moved around. It's nowadays presented in a very famous art gallery in upstate New York, the Dia Beacon Gallery. So when I first saw that, I was with a very good friend of mine who's an art historian. And we got into an argument. I said, this is a piece of crap. This is not a work of art. And if you found it in your backyard, you wouldn't think for a second that it has any artistic qualities. And we had an argument about that. He told me not to be so bloody conservative. And said that, anyway, perfectly sensible argument. Right? My view changed, by the way, since then. Now I wouldn't say it's not a work of art. I would say it's a work of art. It's just not a good one. But anyway, we can have an argument about whether it's a work of art or not. So if we can have an argument about that, and it's a sensible argument, then anyone can have an argument about that. And again, then it's certainly possible that some people will get it wrong. And the some people, in principle, could be most people. Yeah. So suppose that up to a certain point, people would not have thought about this leaning mirror as a work of art, but now they do. They discovered something about the nature of art or nature of works of art that was not known before. Can we say that we were all wrong before, and now we discovered the truth about art? That's the question. I think that's one of the questions. I will use this example in other talks as well for different purposes. More friendly to Dworkin, if you will. But that will come later. So are these kinds of examples the kind that would show that we could have been mistaken about our understanding of the nature of our artifact? I don't think so. Why? Because what happens, especially in the art context, but again, art is just an example. I think the same thing can happen everywhere. I'll exemplify that. Is that the nature of the thing changes over time. What art was 150 years ago is not what art is today. Art constantly changes. In fact, art changes pretty fast, just as it changes between cultures. Yeah. What art was in Europe over centuries is not what art was in Japan or in the Islamic world, etc., etc. So art changes. And changes are not discoveries. Changes are inventions, innovations. Yeah. So when in the beginning of the 20th century, European artists discovered that paintings don't have to have figurative, paintings and sculptures don't have to have figurative compositions. It's cubism, especially abstract paintings. It's not that they discovered something about art that was not known before. It's just that they invented something. It's an innovation. Yeah. Now we have a new form of art, abstract or cubist art or conceptual art later, and so on and so forth. As an analogy, think about the innovations in technology. I mean, most of you are too young to remember that before smartphones, there were cell phones, and they were not that smart. Yeah, they were just phones that you could use distance. Yeah. The invention of smartphones, yeah, the iPhone, was not a discovery. It's not that, oh, wow, now we realize what telephones really are. Yeah. No, it's an invention. We created something new. Yeah. It's related to its previous iteration. Both cell phones, they both have some functions that are common. But it's a new kind of device. It's an invention. Yeah. So the point is that the argument about the impossibility of error does not mean to rule out possibility of continuous changes. In fact, it supports that, right? Things continuously change, including the law, including the understanding of what the law is. I am sure that our understanding of what law is very different from the Romans' understanding of the laws in many respects. Yeah. Can't think of any reason why would that not be the case. Yeah. Lots of things changed since then. But it doesn't mean that they were wrong and we are right. You know, they didn't realize that something is law and now we think it is law. So I think it's generally the case that although ontological mistakes about artifacts always possible, even on a large scale, an entire community cannot be mistaken about what its artifacts are. Yeah. And if that is the case, that should apply to law. If law is an artifact, then entire community, legal community, cannot be mistaken about what its laws are. Yeah, individuals can be mistaken. Some parts of the community can be mistaken. Goes without saying. But to say that an entire legal community gets its laws wrong, yeah, something is the law, whereas it really isn't, or vice versa, makes no metaphysical sense. Yeah. And if that makes no metaphysical sense, then it makes, it puts anti-positivist positions of all kinds and colors in a tough spot. Yeah, that's my argument. I have not demonstrated, I haven't given you an argument why law is an artifact, an intangible artifact, massive artifact. I'm not sure I have an argument for that, right? I mean, to say that something like law is an artifact is what, in a more familiar phraseology, would have been said as, you know, law is a social construct. It's socially constructed. It's not something we find in nature. So if you don't agree with that, I'm not sure how to continue the conversation. I'm not sure what to say. Yeah, maybe we just hit rock bottom. So I'm not sure I have an argument about that. But if you agree that law is an artifact, then I think all this story that I said should follow. Okay, that's it. Time for question.
Well, thank you very much. There's a lot of, yeah, go ahead. Have a wonderful array of ideas here.
Hey, Professor Malma, Daniel, Professor Ronaldo, student. My question is about, you said that some parts of a community can be wrong about an artifact and taking law as an artifact. You know, like, I can think that law is something and he can think that law is that, but what about a large part of the community disagreeing about law? Like Professor Ronaldo likes to use an example, constitutional law in Brazil. What we think of the constitutional law today is not what the constituents mean about it. We change it, and that's okay. But there is it's not like one individual, 2, 4, like 60 to 40 people disagree about what constitutional law is, and taking that as an aspect. There's someone need to be wrong. There's only one correct answer. That kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a very good question. You know, one of the things I skipped in my chapter, but I'm happy to dwell on it. The argument I present does not aim, or certainly does not intend to rule out the possibility of vagueness about these things. So many of these, especially intangible artifacts, there isn't much vagueness about tangible ones, but there is. Actually, it's not there. You can look at an object that can be used as a screwdriver, but wasn't created as a screwdriver. It's something else. It's kind of a borderline case. So it's not a mistake to say that it's a screwdriver. It's not a mistake to deny it and say, no, it's not really a screwdriver. Why is that? Because our language is vague. Our concepts are vague. That's it. So that applies to almost everything, right? Now, one one of the things I argue in my recent book is that no sensible metaphysical view about the nature of law should rule out the possibility of vagueness about the law. There are some borderline cases. And that's actually a very good example, typical example is from constitutional law. It's also the case in the US, right? Certain aspects of constitutional law, you can say, well, it is our law, and others can deny it, and nobody's right or wrong. It's just a borderline case, yeah? So that's fine. I think that does not, it's not a counterexample to my argument, because it's just an example of vagueness, right? Which means that it's neither wrong nor right to deny that. It's just, you know, the broken chair is the chair up to a point, yeah? What that point is, we don't know, and it's not knowable, yeah? So you can say that corrupt law is still law, up to a point. What that point is, difficult to say, it's not knowable, etc. That's fine.
Thank you.
Andre? Yeah. Are there?
Yeah.
Hello, good morning. I would like to thank you of this lecture. It was very, it was a pleasure to be here. My question is a epistemological one, and how could we distinguish between of how we can know ontology and how we can know the artifacts? It have any difference between of how we can know artifact or how we can know ontology? How we can grasp?
Ontology is just the way things are, yeah? Reality, that's ontology. Epistemology is what we know about what things are, yeah? So the difference between artifacts and things that exist by nature is that we can have, we have lots and lots of theories about reality, natural reality. Yeah, that's what science is all about. But one thing we know for sure, that science and any other theory about nature of reality can get things wrong. Yeah, can be mistaken. Always. That's always a possibility. That's one thing we learned over the century. So epistemology and ontology in the sciences obviously can come apart. Yeah. What you know about reality is not necessarily what reality is. In the realm of artifacts, they can come apart, but only in certain ways. That's my point. Yeah. Only in certain ways, not in others. I hope it answers, but if it doesn't, if it's not what you had in mind, tell me.
No, it's okay.
Andre, let me ask you, jump in and to ask you some points. Well, you mentioned, first of all, I'm not so well convinced that every piece of crap can be art or is art. Maybe you were right when you said this is crap. And sometimes there's a famous situation in which someone left his glasses on the floor, and many people stopped there photographing the glasses. They think that it was art, but it was clear. Later acknowledged that it was not art, even though some people could claim that this is art because this create happening there, etc. Well, but my point is this: Well, you also mentioned the language is an artifact and we can speak correctly or incorrectly. But of course, the whole community of English speakers cannot speak English incorrectly, mistakenly. That's pretty sound. But don't you think that the practice of interpretation is also an artifact in a sense that there are some patterns, there are some rules, there are some ways by which we make interpretation, including interpretation of a language. So when we are deciding or discussing about whether a piece of craft or art is art or not, we are not using the meanings of what art is and what art is not according to their majoritarian conventional meanings. What is at stake when people usually disagree is what is the best interpretation of art that will fit better the value, what is considered the value of art, and whether it's proper or not to say that this is a piece of art or whether it's not. And what people usually argue is not that everything is art, but some pieces are bad art. They really disagree about not being art at all. And we would usually say that someone who says that, well, there's no art and non-art, there's simply good art and bad art, this simply postpones the problem, because we still have a struggle about what is good art and what is bad art, to say whether a proposition is true or false. So when we have this evaluative objects like art, don't we depend on some patterns of how to use language according to some values, and a better way of, to use a very famous distinction, conceptualizing the concept of art, which is exactly what is in disagreement. So in this sense, isn't there a kind of disagreement that is not directly dependent on face value conventions, but it's dependent on how we, in a way, interpret in a better way or in a worse way the conventions themselves? So when saying this, I was remembering the debate, the Fichte-Dworkin's debate, in which, well, there's a struggle about who is the community of the experts who say what art is and what is not. But what I think is Dworkin's argument there is basically that there is a better way of understanding how to interpret art, and how to interpret art is connected to the very concept of art. So in a sense, according to your terminology, this would be two different interconnected artifacts, and the very evaluative or interpretative interpretation could be considered according to your own terminology, a kind of artifact. So I was wondering, how would you face this kind of argument? And besides, just to provoke you a little bit more, I don't think you have given a fair characterization of anti-positivist view, because I think there, even in the work of many other authors, they still believe that the shared understandings, that the conventions are at the basis of what we struggle about.
Okay, can I start there?
Sure.
Because that's not disputed.
Okay.
I'm not claiming that anti-positivists disregard shared understandings, conventions, or that's not the point. The point is, they make the following claim. Okay, that's the controversial claim is the following: that it is at least sometimes the case. Again, Dworkin would say always, but others say at least sometimes the case that what the law is, what is legally required or permitted or forbidden or whatever, depends on what is morally the right answer, what is morally correct. Okay? If you give that up, you're not anti-positivist. You're something else, but not anti. So that's the core claim, and all anti-positivist views are committed. Okay? But that means that you have to allow for the possibility that an entire legal community gets some of its laws wrong, because it makes no sense to have the core claim and hold a purely kind of naive subjectivist view about morality that what's morally correct is whatever people think is correct, because then the view becomes really very uninteresting. So you have to be at some level, some minimal level, objectivist about morality, even if not full-blooded realist. But I have to be objectivist. You have to allow for the possibility that the whole community can be mistaken about some moral issue. Maybe not everything, but about some. Which means that a whole community of lawyers can be mistaken about what the law is. And Dworkin, by the way, admits as much. He even gives examples. He's, you know, at least one I remember from his discussion of constitutionalism. So he gives the example of the US Supreme Court's decision to allow the death penalty to stand as constitutional, because there was one decision earlier which said it's unconstitutional. A few years later, Supreme Court decided, no, everything's fine. It's not cruel and unusual punishment. And it's still the law in the US, right? So Dworkin thinks it's not the law because it's morally mistaken. There is no moral justification. So it's a misunderstanding of the US Constitution. So Dworkin would claim that the entire legal community in the US got at least this part of the law wrong. Yeah. And he does not see a problem there. I think he doesn't see a problem with that, not because he hasn't read my paper, though he hasn't. But for two reasons. And one is my direct answer to your first question. One reason is that I think Dworkin would be one of those who would actually deny that law is only a matter of artifacts. There's some sense in which I think he would not quite accept that. I'm not sure I can articulate his view because I find it incomprehensible, but I have a feeling that he wouldn't sign off on the idea that law is only a matter of social construction. It's all constructed. It's all a product of human agency. I'm not sure about that. I'm just guessing. But my main answer is this, and that's actually going to be the topic of maybe my last talk.
The last one.
Yeah. Yes. So there is a big methodological issue here, right? I agree with you and with Dworkin that interpretation is necessarily value dependent. Makes no sense to offer interpretation of this or that, whatever it is, without relying on all sorts of evaluative judgments. And that's certainly true about arts, it's true about law, it's true about everything. Right? But then the question is, what is the role of these interpretative issues and controversies in a theory about the nature of law? And here I think that there is a very important methodological difference between two kinds of theorizing about the nature of law. One is the hermeneutical one, Dworkin's one, which is an attempt to make sense of the law in a certain way. And the other is metaphysical. And my kind of history of philosophy point is that I think that from Austin onwards, with the exclusion of Kelsen, Legal positivists were in the business of metaphysics, even though they wouldn't necessarily call it that way. I think that Hart's theory, even though it's called the concept of law, is not about concepts. It's about metaphysics, social metaphysics, it's social ontology. And I think that the commitments of social ontology and the commitments of hermeneutical theories are different. And there is some sense in which it's true that Hart and Dworkin talk past each other. So that would be the topic of the whole talk, because that takes a lot of background. So in a nutshell, my view is there is metaphysics of law, which interests me and which I think interested Hart, and which I think is the core debate between positivism and anti-positivism. Again, Kelsen excluded. And there is a hermeneutical approach. And the hermeneutical approach, I think Dworkin is totally right on its own terms. He's just wrong about what it shows. But they're just different commitments. Between these two, there is a third, if you ask most of my colleagues what legal theory is all about, they would tell you it's conceptual analysis. And I am still waiting for somebody to explain to me what concepts are and how they differ from the meaning of words, from semantics. I don't know. So I don't know what conceptual analysis is. I know what it was in the Oxford-Cambridge tradition of the 1950s. And you'll find very little of it in Hart's concept of law. Anyway, that's a different topic. We can talk about it later. So I just admit that I have nothing to say about conceptual analysis. If you're interested in that, talk to somebody who understands what concepts are.
And just let me insist on one point, which is, isn't the patterns of interpretation, according to our terminology, is still a kind of artifact? So in this sense.
Sorry, I missed that part of your question. You're right. There are certain areas, law included, but that I think varies enormously between different legal cultures, where certain norms of interpretation are entrenched conventionally or even legally. Yeah. And then, of course, it's just part of the law. They are artifacts. Yeah. But that doesn't make them value dependent. So doesn't go an inch towards Dworkin's theory. It's just part of the law, like any other legal norm. Yeah. I don't know. I'm not a very good lawyer, so examples don't come quickly to my mind. But here's one. No. Sorry. Of course they come to mind. So but it may mean nothing to you. I don't know if you heard the expression canons of interpretation in American law. So there are these rules, of statutory interpretation. They often have these fancy Latin names. And they vary enormously. I mean, some of them are just Gricean maxims, but a lot of them are just kind of rules, Whether they settle anything is not clear because they can come into conflict with other canons. But they're just part of the law. Yeah. They're just part of what needs to be interpreted. Yeah. We can call them rules of interpretation. In some sense, they are rules of interpretation because they apply in a certain context, and the context is statutory interpretation, but they're just part of the law. So I don't see how that changes the picture. Yeah.
Questions? Yes. Introduce yourself and.
Hi, my name is Daniela. Thank you for the very stimulating debate
So
here.
far, there are two Daniels and Daniela.
Yeah, we all have the same
Okay.
name here, apparently. So I wonder, actually, my question is just a clarification. I wonder whether you could explain what you mean by legal community. And I'll try to provide an example of why I want this clarification. So let's return to your art example. Suppose that I go to this art exposition and just see a bunch of sand and the Lenin mirror. And then I say, well, that's not art. And let's say that João here goes with me and says, well, that's not art. And then Marcos Vinicius goes with me and say, well, that's not art. But of course, we are not the competent authority in art to discuss or to establish what art is. And it seems that from that perspective, my opinion is just irrelevant since I'm not part of that community. I was just passing by and I saw this bunch of piece of allegedly art. So I was wondering whether when you're talking about the legal community, there is a difference between ordinary citizens and people who have legal expertise, or whether the main difference is between people who do have legal expertise but do not have authority to dictate what the law is. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. I really like that question and I like your example. And it's really an important part of the story, and it comes up both in legal and art context. And my answer is the same to both and similar. So, of course, there is a great deal of vagueness about what the relevant communities are. But what is common is that there are certain main practitioners or experts in inner circles, and their practices and beliefs have a more profound impact on what the thing is. And then there are outer and outer circles. And if your only part of the art world is that you just occasionally go and see an art exhibit, you're in the very, very outer circle, and probably your views and mine, etc., have very little impact. So this comes up a lot, actually, in the literature on the nature of art, because there is a kind of understanding, and I support that in a paper I wrote recently, that there is something like we could call the art world. And the kind of equivalent of the legal positivist view about art would be that whatever the art world takes to be art is art. And then the question comes up, as you point out, who the hell is the art world? Yeah. The answer is, well, there are different players. Of course, the players varied enormously between different cultures, different times. You know, today is very complicated because there are many players. So there are, if you're talking about the visual arts, yeah, then there are curators, museum curators. They're clearly in the inner circle. Their views about what art is makes enormous impact. There are art dealers, again, clearly in the circle, because their views about what they're willing to pay for and what they consider art is very, very important. There are, you know, my colleagues in art history departments who write papers on art. Less important, with all due respect. Nobody reads their papers anyway. There are various magazines and journals about art. So it's a very complex sociological structure that constitutes the art world community. In the legal case, it's actually a little bit more simple, right? There are fewer kinds of agents. So obviously, I don't know if obviously, I mean, we just assume, but I think rightly so, in most legal systems, modern legal systems, judges are the core, right? Because they get to determine what counts as law and what the law is, yeah? And that's especially true, I think, in common law systems with a strong tradition of precedent, that higher court judges have a major impact on what the law is, and lower courts have a lesser impact, etc. And then there are kind of outer circles, legislatures, Even more important, probably administrative agencies, because the way they understand the law has a major impact on what the law is. And lawyers, legal practitioners, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's vague, it's diffuse, but I think it has the same pattern of these concentric circles with core moving outwards of what constitutes the relevant community. But in the legal case, it's easier because you just cannot say that capital punishment is not constitutional in the US. It's terrible. It shouldn't be. Yeah. What the hell do we have a constitution for if it allows capital punishment? All sorts of objections are relevant. But to say that all American lawyers just got it wrong, yeah, what the Supreme Court says the law is not really the law, makes no sense. It's really, to me, on the same level as saying that red chairs are not chairs. Does it answer your question?
Other questions? Iago.
Hi, I'm Iago. I have a question on the criteria of, let's say, recognizability of the object as being a part of some kind of being, an example, a token of some kind. I think that the problem boils down to when we're talking about failing to create something that is of a kind, or failing to create something that's a good example or accomplishes well its function. So I don't know, I just want you to explain a little bit more what it is to be recognizable as such. Let's say I can recognize if I have something that isn't a knife, or something that is a bad knife, let's say a blunt knife, or something that is a broken knife, even though they all have different characteristics as relates to the original function and intended use of the artifact. What makes it recognizable that I can see this was once a knife, a functional knife, now it is a broken knife. Apparently it's not its use. If it was its use, I will be able to say of both a blunt knife, a broken knife, or something that isn't a knife, that they're all not knives because they're not being used as knives should.
Okay, so Iago, there are two issues here, at least two. One issue that I think bothers you is one that I thought I already answered: vagueness. Right? It's just the nature of things that they are vague. Right? Mostly it's the nature of our use of language, but sometimes it's deeper than that. A blunt knife can still be a knife, but at some point it's not a knife anymore. What that point is, we don't know. Yeah. So there are big debates in philosophy of language and logic, etc., about nature of vagueness, and we can spend the whole semester talking about the nature of vagueness. I personally love that topic, but it takes a lot of takes some background. One reason we don't like vagueness is because it leads to a paradox. The Sorites paradox, the heap paradox. And then there's a huge debate in philosophy of language and logic, etc., how deep the Sorites paradox is, and how much philosophical effort we have to do to try to avoid it, and things like that. Is it avoidable? All sorts of problems with vagueness. It's really complicated. But nobody denies that there is vagueness. And well, even that is not accurate. There is a view that denies that there is genuine vagueness. It's a view of an old friend, Tim Williamson, It's called the epistemic theory of vagueness. It's kind of crazy view, but anyway, by and large, with the exception of Tim Williamson and a couple of his students, nobody denies that vagueness is just something reality. It's a phenomenon, right? It has its own logic. And the logic is that you would always, the problem with vagueness is not that there are borderline cases. The problem is we don't know where they begin and where they end. Some people call it second order vagueness. I call it something else. It doesn't matter. The problem is, take a chair, start breaking it. Yeah. At some point, it will not be a chair anymore. The problem is not that there are borderline cases where it's not a mistake to say that it is a chair or not. The problem is we don't know when the borderline cases start. One more, break and then it becomes a borderline. There is no such point. Yeah. So it's such a deep problem. Yeah. That none of these arguments about the nature of artifacts, etc., can be affected by it because it applies across the board. It also applies to natural phenomena. Yeah. Is a big pond a lake or not? Yeah. So that's one issue. The other issue is the type token relation. Yeah. And that's completely separate. I mean, not completely, but it's separate, right? So my point is, and that I think most people who write about artifacts kind of make a similar point, same one. Not everything that humans do can count as an artifact, because then we'll end up with an absolutely infinite number of unrecognizable artifacts. Yeah. If I get up from this chair, I do something. Have I created something that we can call an artifact? Surely not. Yeah. So the idea is that it makes sense to regard certain objects, tangible or intangible, as artifacts if they are products, right? If they are identifiable as a kind, if they can be replicated, if they have some durability, et cetera, et cetera. Then you can press the question, but what about inventions? We now know that a wheel is an artifact. What about the first wheel? Yeah, if there was such a thing, probably wasn't. Yeah, well, it's still a product of a kind. Yeah, a new product. It's like the smartphone. We didn't have smartphones before iPhone. It's an invention, but we can identify it as a product of a kind, even if it's new. Yeah. So I think we have to work with that. Otherwise, we just don't have a sensible notion of artifacts. Yeah. But again, it's bound to have borderline cases. There is a whole category, like the cherry tomatoes I mentioned, that some people call nature facts. They're somewhere in between. We manipulate some aspect of nature, but we don't really create something that is a standard artifact. Think about damming a lake. Put a dam. Now you have a lake. Sorry, damming a river, and now you have a lake. Is the lake part of nature? Is it a natural, something that exists by nature? Yes and no. Yeah. Wouldn't exist but for the dam, but it's still not something we produced. At some point, all you have to say is c'est la vie, life is difficult. They have these borderline cases and,
I think my question was actually more basic than that, but thank you for explaining. But I was trying to say, does recognizability, is it linked to function? Is it linked to physical aspects, or just the function of all those things, the things that we characterize the object? Because an object, from what I see, can also be part of more than one kind, let's say. So a red chair is both a red object and a chair. So that was what was confusing me.
Okay, that should not confuse you. Actually, so I have a red chair, made of wood, and, you know, embroiled, lots of things, lots of properties the object can have, right? Some properties are relevant to its being a chair, and some are not. What determines that? In the case of tangible artifacts, it's mostly the function, right? But it's also partly what I call situational properties, yeah? So the function of Louis XIV's chair exhibited in the Louvre is not to sit on, yeah? How do we know that? Because it's in the Louvre, yeah? But barring that, sort of putting aside these situational properties, in the case of tangible artifacts, it's mostly a question of function, yeah? And that's why redness is not part of what makes it a chair, and the decoration is not part of what makes it a chair. And in my view, the intention of the whoever created that is not part of what makes it a chair. You know, somebody could have intended the chair to be a piece of modern art, but if, you know, you buy it in a store and you sit on it, it's a chair. In the case of intangible artifact, the story is more complicated, right? Because it's partly a matter of functions, but partly a matter of how we use things. But it's partly a matter of content, of how we understand the content. I don't think we can give a purely functional account of contents, right? But I think we have an intuitive understanding of content, right? So, yeah. But in both cases, we have to have a type token relation, right? If I write something that purports to be a poem, but it's not, it's just gibberish, then it's not an artifact, right? Because it's not a token of a type, even if I wanted it to be, I just failed.
Good morning. My name is João, John in English. It's easier. My question is a kind of clarification, I think. When you say during your presentation that you are concerned of what law is, at first I understand that your main concern was the ontological nature of the artifact law. The artifact in this case law. But during the presentation, then with the questions, I wonder if your main concern is with what law is, what an artifact can be recognized as law. It has this legally character, or with the meaning of the law. The meaning of what I mean is the content of the law. That's my question. Thank you very much.
Good question. The answer is that in this chapter, in this paper, I'm not interested in the question of what makes something legal. Yeah, it's just not the issue. So the question of what grounds legality, right, is a totally separate question. Yeah, and I think that that's where the debate between positivism and anti-positivism lies, right, on the grounding of legality. But in this paper, I'm interested in the possibility of mistakes, of errors about the content of the law. You know, if the law requires X, yeah, can we be mistaken about that? Can we say, no, we thought that it requires X all these decades, but we were wrong. It didn't really require X. Yeah, that's the question, if that's possible. Now, yeah, that's the simple answer.
Maybe if you don't have, I have two more points. I think we have time for just a postponing of the end of your Yeah, conference. The first one, do you think there is any normative implication of the kind of view that you presented here? And I mean, in terms of how to understand or how to interpret law, or just a descriptive a new strategy of answering the question, what is law? And my second question is, how would you compare this kind of view of law as an artifact with this trend towards considering law as plans? I'm thinking about a kind of vision supported by Scott Shapiro and many others.
Okay, my answer to the first question is probably not. I mean, I certainly don't think immediately anything normative follows from it. You can kind of make the argument that the more we realize that law is a social construction, law is an artifact, we should take more responsibility over its content. It's kind of what Hart's view was. Yeah. That the more we realize that law is not a gift of gods or morality or nature, it's something we make, and we can make it better or worse, we should feel more responsibility. Well, you can make that argument, but it's not part of my agenda. All right, it's not. The law as plans. So I think that the law is no more of a plan than languages. Nobody planned English. Nobody planned Sao Paulo as a city. It just evolved. Huh? Certainly did it. Yeah. Yeah, that's my view about the plan theory. It just misses the target. I think that what Scott did, if I may say so, is he took Bratman's theory of shared agency and expanded it beyond its legitimate borders. Bratman's theory of shared agency, people doing things together in a planned way of planning, has some essential built-in constraints. One, that it's not hierarchical. Two, that the number of people is relatively small. Three, that I forget now. There are a whole bunch of constraints. None of the, together, they certainly don't apply to the law. If you drop those constraints, then very little else makes sense. A million people don't get to plan anything together, not even 1,000. So anyway, yeah, well, right.
So in a way, plans are just a special kind of artifact that is not well fitted to describe what law is.
I think it's not fitted to describe what most artifacts, everything I call massive artifacts, almost everything, cannot result from plans. Natural language, most religions, sometimes religions are planned, the Mormon religion is probably somebody's plan. But most religions are like that, right? The myth about the founding fathers of religions are usually much later than the history of the religion. So most religions are not plans. They're massive artifacts. Myths, legends, all of that. Who planned Greek mythology, et cetera, et cetera.
Questions? Just let me make my final question now, okay? And then we can.
Now comes the knockdown argument.
No, not just curiosity. I was wondering when you mentioned Dworkin's argument that according to him, capital punishment would not be law. Maybe he could reply, oh, not as simple as that. And saying, for example, of course, from a using his terminology, from a sociological point of view, of course, capital punishment in the US is law. as much as Nazi law was law, that's okay. If we take the use of the concept in this special context. However, if you move the question to what is law when the court is deciding whether this is law or this is not law, I mean, whether you ask whether you have a right not to be murdered by the state, at that level, if you use a different kind of concept, so it's a different language game. So if you're taking this kind of use of the concept, this the answer he would have given would not be that simple. That simply is not law. On one sense of the law, I think he wouldn't disagree that this is law. I mean, in the sense that, of course, it was enforced, but it was a wrong decision. This is what I think he would have said.
Okay, this is I agree and don't agree. I mean, sort of depends partly on Dworkin when, at what stage of his philosophical thought. So let's think about Dworkin's kind of post-Low's empire, right? The fully worked out hermeneutical interpretive theory of law. So the interpretive theory very explicitly can acknowledge all sorts of moral errors as not necessarily disqualifying something from being law, right? Not everything has to work out perfectly, right? So if you read a novel and you think, you know, what's the best on the interpretation, blah, 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 it doesn't mean that everything's perfect. There might be some errors, it's still part of the novel. So the same about law, not everything has to be perfect. There might be mistakes, etc. That's fine. So in the overall big picture, there's no problem. The problem is that Dworkin would have to admit that when the courts make systematic and long-term errors, they get the law wrong. They make the kind of mistake that I argue is impossible. Yeah. So it's not true that every kind of moral mistake creates a problem for Dworkin's theory, but I think certain types of mistakes he would have to admit that if they are morally wrong, at some point they become not part of the law, right? Or vice versa. Sometimes it can go the other way around. Something is morally required, but the law refuses to acknowledge it, to give effect to it, can be part of the law even though the courts don't recognize it. So I think he has to allow for some types of comprehensive errors. You're right that the question when and under what conditions is a bit more complicated than I gave the impression, right? But it all comes from, I mean, not all, but part of it, and Dworkin would be the first to recognize an assumption about the nature of morality, that morality is such that everybody can get it wrong at some points. So he's very explicitly an objectivist about morality. Same about natural lawyers. I mean, if you look at Finnis's writings, which I'm not necessarily recommending, but if you have nothing better to do, you will see that he spends enormous amount of effort on the nature of morality. He's a cognitivist about morality. And he understands that without that cognitivism, which is a form of objective view about morality, the legal theory doesn't work. It's pointless, right? So all these antipositivist positions start from recognizing that moral error is possible, and sometimes it makes the law to be something else from what it seems. Okay? Yeah. I mean, some of it will come up in.
Oh yes, I'm sure. Have well, thank you again, Professor Marmor. It was a great opportunity to discuss with you. and especially to discuss. And I'm glad that we are going to have 2 other opportunities to deepen our discussion. 3 more, yeah, okay, 3 more, sorry. And so thank you again for coming. I will, and it's time for lunch. So thank you everybody for coming here too.
Thank you. Thank you. Hope to see you again soon. Bye.